How's it going, church family? Welcome to another weekend. We are finally in December, the last month of the year, the last month of 2020. Praise Jesus. Go ahead and put in the comments. Let's see, make sure the chat is alive today. Make sure you guys are awake. You had your morning coffee. If you're happy that it's December, let's give some praise hands, whether the prayer hands, maybe a number one pointing to the sky, whatever it is. Let's show some celebration that we are in December of the last the last month of this year. Praise God. So in this last month, we got together as a staff and we were trying to figure out what series we're going to have. And usually we're like, hey, you know what? Let's have a Christmas series that's pointing towards Advent. And we were really thinking, and we felt inspired by God. We feel like God put this in our hearts, in our spirits, that we need to continue this spirit of making a difference in the world around us. And so, prayerfully, we decided that we're going to extend our Changemaker series because, let's be honest, last week, hearing all of those stories last week during the interviews were an awesome experience, each and every single one of them. They were inspiring, and we wanted to keep inspiring all of you and see if we can seriously make a huge change in our community. Now, here at Bolingbrook Church, if you guys are joining us for the first time, we're part of a world church, but Bolingbrook Church, the reason why we're called Bolingbrook Church is because we want to make a difference in the village of Bolingbrook. We want to know, at least for me, I want to sit at the end of my years looking back at my ministry here at Bolingbrook Church and knowing that Bolingbrook, the village, was made a better, more loving, more caring, more kind, more spiritual, more God-following village because of the church. We want to know that Bolingbrook, the village, was made better because of Bolingbrook, the church. And so we are on a mission. God has given this in our hearts to continue making a difference in the world around us. And you are probably watching because you've heard something about our church that is making an impact in our community. Praise God for that. But I'm here to tell you that the reason why we're continuing this series of Changemakers is because we want to we want to bring in more people to be able to make a change in the communities around us. Not just the village of Bolingbrook, but the communities in our hearts, in our personal lives, with our families, with our coworkers. We believe that each and every single one of you is called to make a difference, a change, a godly change in the communities that you are a part of. And so we're continuing this series. And as I get to open up the second half of the series, I want to thank you all so much for joining us and making that decision, because if you're watching this, I pray that at the end you will have one more tool underneath your belt and feeling a little more confident in making a change in our communities. So let's get started. We find ourselves in the Bible, of course, and what better way to start off than something that's very practical? And if you look on the title of this sermon, it's a very simple title, and it's called Show Up. Let's make sure the chat is alive and still following us here. Go ahead, and if you are watching us live right now, go ahead and type in the chat, I showed up. Go ahead and do that now, because honestly, showing up is half the battle, isn't it? Showing up is the first thing that you need to do when doing anything that is substantial. Showing up to class, showing up to work, showing up for your family, showing up is possibly one of the first steps in controlling a change-making system in your life. And so if you have showed up today, congratulations. You have accomplished the first step. And showing up is so important because and we're in the holiday seasons, and I come from a very, very close-knit family. And pre-COVID, when we'd all gather together in our homes for Thanksgiving and for Christmas, we would always have a Christmas party or a Thanksgiving party. My family would host Thanksgiving at our house. My aunt would host Christmas at her house. And we always knew that if we wanted our family to show up on time, we had to make sure that they came early. So we told them a date that was at least 2 hours before the actual start time of the party, right? Because we knew that if we wanted them to show up, we had to make sure that we gave them time to be able to, finish the sentence, show up. And so if we had a party at 7:30, we would tell my aunt and her family, we'd tell them, hey, come at 5:30. Actually, no, it'd come at 5 because we knew that they would start getting ready at 5 and they would leave the house by 5:30 and they would have to still pick up their food by 6 and they would have to travel another 45 minutes and maybe on the road they'll hit traffic because they come from near O'Hare and we'll ballpark it around 2 hours prior to the actual time. Let me know in the chat if you know what this feels like to invite a family member and tell them an earlier time before they actually get there so they show up on time. And by 7 o'clock, if they're still not there, the party at 7:30, mind you, if they're still not there, we're going to give them a call. And on the phone, I'm saying, Auntie, when are you planning on, you can finish a sentence if you want to, showing up? Because showing up is half the battle. Now, when we get to our family gatherings, there's more battles that might ensue with food and with seating and all this stuff. But showing up is half the battle. If we look in the Bible, we see how showing up is so important. And we see tons of stories where people don't show up and we see what happens to those people. We look at David. If you know the story of David and Bathsheba, David is in a time where his nation is going to war, and the kings are supposed to go to war with them. And instead of actually going to war, what David does is it says that he stays back in his temple. It says that he stays back where he's comfortable, where no one's bothering him, where he gets to do whatever he wants. He stays back when he's supposed to show up for war. He sees a beautiful lady on the roof who's someone else's wife, sleeps with her, and then has the audacity to try to cover it up and kill her only husband, who is a faithful servant, a faithful soldier in his army. Turns out that God also likes to show up when we don't. And in his story, God recorrects him and sends a prophet, and that prophet tells him about all the things that he did wrong, and David then repents. And then you look at even Peter's story. There's a classic story of not showing up. Well, Peter showed up in body, but not showed up in heart. Because when he told Jesus that, don't worry, Jesus, I'll show up for you whenever you need me. I'll show up for you if people try to take your life. Wherever you go, you're going, God, I'm going to go with you. I will show up. And as Peter was at the trials of Jesus, he might have been there and showed up in body, but not in his heart. And he spoke 3 denials. 3 denials. He showed up in presence, but didn't show up on purpose. Showing up is half the battle. So now we take a look. I want to direct us to a story in the Old Testament. A story that I've actually have been wanting to preach, but God told me back then that it wasn't the right time. And I think it's because he's been saving it for this time right now. And I hope I can convince you of that when I go into the text. It's in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a story that is part of a couple book series of times where the temple of Jerusalem itself is being rebuilt. And so we find ourselves in Nehemiah chapter 1. And just to give some context about Nehemiah, like I said, is part of Ezra, that you can kind of have them as kind of the same type of scene where Israel is being exiled into Babylon, and for hundreds of years they've been there. But a new kingdom has taken over Babylon, this kingdom called Persia, and the king at that time is starting to send Israelites back to Jerusalem to live. He's actually releasing them out of exile. And Nehemiah is one of the people that had been born in the exile, where his fathers and his grandfathers and his ancestors grew up in Jerusalem, but he's never known it. And so we pick up his story in chapter 1. Let's take a read. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, on the 20th year, I was in the citadel of Susa. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with another man, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. See, my favorite thing about Nehemiah is that he was just a regular guy. He was a regular guy in the Old Testament who had a day job as a cupbearer of the king. And he wasn't a priest. He wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a prophet. He was just an ordinary person that was following God and decided that he was going to show up for what God had planned in his heart. See, Nehemiah was an ordinary person with a God-sized burden on a human-sized heart. And when you have a God-sized burden, when you care about the things that God cares about on your heart, you have no other choice than for that thing to spill over and cause God to continue to show up where you are. He had a God-sized burden on a human-sized heart. How many of you right now can look at the world around you, look at your neighborhood, in your family, and you know that God is putting a burden on your heart? I want to let you know that that is supernatural. That isn't something that you came up on your own. When you have a burden for anything in your community, when you feel that God is placing something on your heart, know that it's not up to you to try to do it all. It's up to you to try to show up for God and let Him do the work through you. Nehemiah was just an ordinary man with a God-sized burden on his human-sized heart, and he let that overflow into the world around him. That's a change maker. He didn't have this grand position in the Jewish leadership, but he did have a position. I want to let you know, if I'm speaking to anyone right now, you don't have to have a position to do what God has purposed you for. You don't have to have a position to do what God has purposed you for. Because once you put yourself in a position to worship and glorify God, He will submit His will into your life, and He will allow you to fulfill the purpose that He has planned over your life, to be a change maker. Verse 3, they said to me, "Those who survived exile are back in the province and are in great trouble and disgrace. The walls of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." There is this particular word that I want you to hold on to here, and that is the word wall. It's a very insignificant word, but I want you to understand a part of this, and I'll get into it a little bit later, because walls mean something very special to the Jewish nation. But let's keep reading. "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept, and for some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, 'O Lord, God of heaven, and great and awesome God, who keeps His covenant of love with those who love Him and obey His commands.'" So there's a couple things I want to point out before we go any further. And I want you to notice at the timing. And notice the timing here. It says in my Bible, the NIV, it says that in the month of Kislev. Go ahead and say Kislev from where you are. You gotta get that hard K in there. In the month of Kislev is in the Jewish calendar compared to the Gregorian calendar that we use now. The month of Kislev falls right in between November, end of November, early December. Now, remember I told you that I've been wanting to share this story before. I always thought that Nehemiah's story was amazing. It was a beautiful story. But something in me told me, David, not yet. And I realize this now, because where we are right now in our timeline is right where Nehemiah finds himself in the beginning of his story. If that's not evidence enough that God is going to do something amazing with this church, with you right now, then I don't know what else will convince you. This is taking place right where we are right now. And he hears the stories of people going back to Jerusalem, the place where his fathers grew up, where his fathers are buried, a land that he knows very little of, but he does know what happened there. He does know of the God that showed up to the Israelites in their area. And he knows that God very intimately. We know this Because the first thing that he does, and by the way, I'm going to give you three different ways. No, I'm not going to give it to you. God's going to give it to you through the story. Three different ways that God is asking us to show up. And here in this first one, we know that Nehemiah has an intimate relationship with God, because when he hears that the walls are destroyed, the first thing he does is he prays. He petitions the God of heaven. The first way that you can start showing up to make a change in the world around you is to show up in your relationship with God. It sounds like an easy thing to do, but if we actually look at how much time, and now I'm speaking to myself now, if we actually look at how much time we spend with God and how much time we actually spend doing ministry, we'll find it very lopsided, where we're spending so much time doing ministry, doing church, and little time spending it with God. But Nehemiah is saying to us here that when the burden of ministry falls on you, you need to fall at the feet of Jesus. Woo, woo, woo. I need you to understand that Nehemiah understood that the first way that he could show up and make a difference is to show up and be in the presence of God. Because we can try to make a difference in the world, but if God isn't making a difference in your heart, what you do in the world means nothing. It means that you're just giving what is nasty in here to what's out there. You actually might be corrupting what you're working on if your heart is not changed. And so here he shows up. Everyone type in their comments, I'm going to show up. He shows up to his relationship with God. Verse 4, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned. I fasted and prayed before God of heaven. It's amazing that he knows that the first thing to do is to turn his will over to God. When we were doing our interview stories last week, we had an interview from a woman named Lorraine Saintis, and you can still watch that video, hopefully after the service. And in her story, she knew that when she felt a burden on her heart from God, the first thing that she said she did with her husband was to pray. Pray individually, and they came together and they said, did you hear what I heard? And they both agreed because they showed up in their relationship with God. Listen to this. O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. If you look at his whole prayer from verse 5 all the way down to the end of the chapter, you'll find that Nehemiah spends no time talking about what he's going to do. He spends no time at all making plans. All he does is pray. Fast and pray in the presence of the God of his fathers. He references the God of back then who has kept his covenant of love, because he knows that if God showed up for his fathers and if God showed up for his grandfathers, that same God will show up for him today, because he understands that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And he calls upon the God of his fathers. The God of his fathers will show up for what he has been doing in his life now. And then it says in chapter 2, in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Artaxerxes, when they were brought before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. I want you to notice the timing. The timing says that he started in the month of Kislev, November, December, and then he ended in the month of Nisan. That's 3 months of just praying to God. Just 3 months of showing up day after day in his relationship with God and really aligning his will to God and saying, God, this is the burden, but here is my heart. Do what you will. Verse 2 in chapter 2. So the king asked me, why does your face look sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. I was very much afraid, said Nehemiah. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it that you want? Watch what happens. Nehemiah says, I then prayed to the God of heaven and answered the king. He understands that he has to show up to his relationship with God first, because it's not him that does the work. It's God who does the work through him. And so as he is worried, he's scared about what he's about to do. And I want to let you know, those who are watching, who are scared about taking the next step, this is a sermon for me, because I get scared to take that next step into what God is calling me to do. When we feel scared, know that that is normal. And all God is asking to do is show up in my relationship with you. And I will give you the words to say, the things to do, the provisions. I will give you everything you need if you start your time and just show up with me. Notice that when he prayed, he knew what to say. He was no longer scared after he prayed, because he knew that God was going to do the work that he's always meant to do, to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting that in Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding process of Jerusalem happens in different phases, where Zerubbabel in Ezra starts off by rebuilding the temple, and then Ezra tries to rebuild the culture of the Israelites, and here Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls. And it's very interesting. The idea of walls in the Jewish understanding is very different for us. It meant something different. There's a reason why the Israelites felt disgraced when they saw their walls destroyed. Because back before they had walls, back before they had a temple, they would go around and they would encamp in tents around different areas. They were nomads. They had no place of dwelling. And so as they traveled, instead of just pitching a tent anywhere, they had a very specific way of making their encampments, which was they would make it in a form of a circle. And they would have the tents on the outside form the perimeter of their encampment, and that would provide protection. The tents were acted as a sort of wall. In fact, the word grace in Hebrew comes from that very idea. This idea of how they made their camps, that there was a wall of protection. And so when they talk about God's grace, they talk about his protection. And you're not allowed to come into the tent area. You're not allowed to pass through unless you can prove that you are part of the bloodline. I hope you know where I'm going with this. Because their walls meant that only their family members, the ones that knew that they meant good for them, they didn't mean harm for them, were let into the area. But now that these walls are destroyed, they feel that the grace of God is gone. They feel that they no longer find favor in God's eyes. I want to let you know that there are people in the world around us, in the cities around us, in the village that we live in, on our street, in your own home. They might be sitting right next to you. You might be that person right now that feels that your walls of provision, of protection, of God's grace are destroyed. You might be feeling, or they might be feeling, that there's nothing more for me to do. My life is over. The provisions are gone. God has lost his sight on me. 2020 has been a year that has ripped, just like the Israelites. We think we're separated from them, but we're actually not. We actually share a lot in common with these Israelites, because they were taken from their land. Everything was taken from them. And when they go back to normal, everything's destroyed. Everything's different. And we live in a time right now where we're experiencing the same exact thing. Things have been taken. Jobs have been taken. Lives have been taken. And some of us might feel that God's hand, his grace, his favor is no longer on us. It's hard, it's scary. But it's amazing that when we decide to start showing up, something different happens. Listen to this. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put on my heart to do for Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah sets up the second thing that he's telling us to the ways that we could show up. The first one was to show up in our relationship with God. Be present to God. Let your life be present at the feet of Jesus and really take in his presence. And the second thing is to actually go to the work that God has called you to. Show up to the plans that God has for you. Show up to the purposes God has. It's important that we do this because it's so easy in our church world today to outsource justice, I call it. To just write a check and say, all right, well, I guess I've done what I need to do. Just write the check and it's gone. And it's so easy to leave it at that. But God is saying, if I've put on your heart a burden, show up. There are so many organizations that are happening right now. This church is one of them that have a vision for what God has planned for the world around us. And we can actually piggyback off of what they're doing. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. I mean, you can if that's what God has called you to. But here, Nehemiah is saying, I'm going to actually go myself. I'm going to be present in body and in mind. And watch what he does. It says that by night he went through the valley gate towards the jackal wall and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem. Not only did he show up, he showed up with intention. He showed up with purpose. He wasn't just going to show up and just monotonously robot himself through the walls, but actually take incentive and initiative and intentionality in examining what God has put before him. He didn't just ask for money to go on a mission trip. He didn't just send someone else to do it. He went himself. He showed up himself because, like I said, there are plenty of organizations that are working in the world around us right now that we can piggyback off of, that we can show up to. And like Hinsdale Bolingbrook Hospital could have started their own food pantry, but instead they knew that we had started ours already, and they showed up to that work. God is asking us to show up to the purpose that he's called us to the work that he's called us to. That's why we have a whole month of things to do, these activities, these change-making events happening, from our hospital blessing this coming Monday to our food pantry, to our Gifts of Love gift card giveaway for our low-income families that walk through our food pantry. We have our blood drive as well. We have all these things that God might be calling you to show up in. Go ahead, chat. In the chat right now, go ahead and type in, I'm going to show up to blank. Find one of the 4 things that we have laid out for you and say, I will show up. I will be there present in that work, the work that God has called us to. Because here at Bolingbrook Church, we have been called to a specific vision to create spaces for the people that God missed the most. And the amazing thing about community is that it calls people together and says, hey, we can be present in the lives of others. And that leads us to our third and final point. Read here. And after Nehemiah had just finished examining and talking to some officials, listen to what he says. Verse 16, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because I had yet to said anything to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. I want you guys to notice this. Nehemiah says that they would be doing. Do you understand that? Because he knows, I'm sorry I'm segueing, but it just popped out to me that he says that these people would be doing the work. Because he knew in advance that if God purposed, God will provide. Woo-wee. If God told me that I'm going to do it, he's going to help me do it. If he gave me a purpose, if he gave me a plan, then he has provisions. That's what Jehovah Jireh is. It's God, my provider. He says that these people will be doing the work. Chat one more time. Go ahead and say, I'm going to show up and do the work. Go ahead and type that, because God knows that you are a part of change making. God understands, and he's given us the vision, and he says that there are people waiting to do the work. And listen to this. This is our third and final point. When I said to them, you see the trouble that we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. The idea of the wall meant so much to them because, like I said, it talked about the way they encamped, and if they rebuild the wall, it would be a symbol that God still has grace for them, that God still has favor for them, that God still has protection for them, that God is still for them. The last point is to show up for your neighbors. Show up to the people that are in your community and let them know that rebuilding will start. That I'm here to help you rebuild the hope that you have lost in your life. There are people that are in our communities, in our streets, in our homes, in your family right now that have lost hope for the future. But Nehemiah says, I'm going to help you rebuild the walls that give us hope. And in our day, we understand that God is rebuilding hope in our lives. Listen to what happens. And as I told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me, and what the king had said to me, they replied, let us start building. And so they began the good work. God is calling us to show up in the lives of people who are hopeless, to show up in the lives of people that are hungry, who are homeless, who are depressed, who have lost everything. There are people in our own community right now at Bolingbrook that have lost hope, and God is asking you to be there for them, to just be present with them, because that's what gives us hope, when we know that God has sent someone to be with us. Going back to Peter's story. Ooh, watch this. Going back to Peter's story. Peter, in his hopelessness, as he said that he would show up to Jesus, denied Jesus 3 times, realized that he had lost the grace of God, that he had lost the favor of God. He felt that there was no more that God would want to do with him. And in that hopelessness, he hears the words from Mary, who heard from Jesus, who showed up out of the grave and said, call the other disciples and Peter. Do you know why he said, and Peter? Because when he says, and Peter, he's saying to Peter, I'm still going to show up in your life when you don't show up at all. Because it's not about your faithfulness to me, it's about my faithfulness to you. And Jesus says, I'm going to show up in your life. And after Jesus showed up in Peter's life, Peter was changed. He became a change maker. He went out, and we see it in the books of Acts, proclaiming, showing up for God in the world around him, in Jerusalem, in Samaria, in Judea, and in all the world. And now we are living in the reality of someone whose life was changed when Jesus showed up in their lives. And at the end of days, when God comes back down, when Jesus again shows up in the world, in his second showing up, come on, in his second showing, when Jesus comes back to earth, he'll look at us and say, well done, my good and faithful servants. And I'll paraphrase this. You showed up. You kept the faith. You ran the race. You showed up to your relationship with me. You showed up to the plans I had for you. You showed up for your neighbors. Well done, my good and faithful servant. And he'll show up, and he'll wipe every tear from our eye. He'll wipe away the hopelessness that we've had. He'll wipe away all the mistakes, all the disgrace, all the sin, and he will say, gone are the old ways of doing things. Behold, I am doing something new. Do you know what that means? He says, I am making a change. And as we wait for that change to come, he's saying, go and be my change makers in all the world. Go on the mission that I've showed you. Rebuild the hope that people have lost, and let them know that my grace is still sufficient. My hands are not too short to save. My grace extends to all of you by the blood of Jesus, who showed up. God in human form showed up for you so that you can show up and change the world.
Thank you for watching and tuning in. If you've been impacted today, we want to invite you to do 3 things. Number 1, create a space for yourself by joining the BC community, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and being with us every weekend. Number 2, create a space for those you're connected to. Share this message with your family or your friends, with your coworkers, or anyone that you know might benefit from this. And number 3, create space by praying about partnering with us by giving and journeying alongside us as we continue to create space for the people God misses most. If this is something you would like to do, go ahead and click on the giving link in the description below. And know that as a Bolingbrook Church, we are continuing to create spaces for the people God misses the most by sharing the good news of Jesus to those who are far from God, not just in Bolingbrook or Chicagoland, but all around the world. And we want to thank you in advance for partnering with us. God bless.